Welcome to another episode of the Untold Tales audio anthology. This episode we share with you a new original short story written by Don Muchow and narrated by Dr. Jeffrey A. Robinson. The Impersonators. Wanted. Actor. Non-union. SF area. Doesn't have to be good. Garvin Belmont thought it was a joke at first, but at the bottom of the classified ad was a phone number. And owing to the fact that after 2 years of internet searches, video interviews, and even hiring his own agent and publicist, he'd gotten nowhere, he was down to digging in the classified section of an almost never-read newspaper and was ready to jump at anything. He also figured that anyone willing to run such an ad was equally desperate. After 4 years of living with a night shift roommate who snored throughout the day and had a really bad attitude when awakened, Garvin was ready for anything. It was a bonus if it was actually acting. He tore the ad out of the newspaper and dialed the number on his cell phone, an ancient android with a cracked screen that had been taped together so many times it was almost unreadable. The display was so bad that a month ago he'd taken to using a screencasting app to send his keyboard to another device that didn't have a cell connection, so he could dial numbers. When he slid the jackleg device combo out of his backpack to make a call, it looked like he was unpacking a bomb from a sandwich bag. "Hello," said a voice at the other end. Hi," said Garvin. "I'm calling about the acting job. Tell me about it. But first, no spec work, no porn, no snuff." "Of course not," said the voice. "It's a full-time job, salary, and benefits. It even has stock options." "What's the catch?" asked Garvin. "It's 24/7, said the voice. "Some people don't like that." "This is an impersonation job," said Garvin. "You know professional impersonation is illegal, right?" "Yes," said the caller. "That will not be a problem. I'll tell you at the interview. I'll send you the address and time shortly. Goodbye." Then, without further ceremony, the voice on the other end hung up. Shortly thereafter, Garvin got a text with an address. Meanwhile, Garvin's roommate, Lewis, rolled over on the couch and placed a pillow over his own head. "That's some fucking weird shit, man," he said. "Sorry, Lewis," said Garvin. "I didn't realize you weren't in your room." "Couldn't sleep," said Lewis. "Some asshole was talking on the phone." "I said I was sorry." Garvin grabbed his hoodie, earbuds, and monowheel and headed out of the apartment to the front door of the building. It was a 3-story brownstone in Emery Bay Village that had seen better days. There was a park on Hollis that he liked to go to that had shade, and the homeless problem wasn't too bad. He decided to grab a box of chicken nuggets on the way and stop there for a quick bite. He started thinking about the job. He had no idea what they wanted, but since it was apparently in Northern California and near the valley, and the pay was good, it was probably some tech thing. That was good enough. An acting job nearby was almost too good to be true, especially one with health benefits and travel expenses. In L.A., there was no way he could have afforded $2,000 a month for a one-bedroom without risking his life. He'd been robbed once in Chicago at knife point and didn't want to repeat the experience. When Garvin got to the address, 401 North Beecher, the interview space was a lot more casual than he expected. In fact, it was an apartment complex. That wasn't necessarily uncommon among some tech startups, so Garvin looked around as he opened the outer door. As he entered, an interior door cracked open on the ground floor. "Please come in, Mr. Belmont," said a voice. "Sorry to keep you waiting." Garvin looked around. "Where are you?" he asked as he approached the door to the main room where he'd heard the voice, and opened it the rest of the way. The room was empty, except for a chair and a flat screen at the opposite wall. As he entered, the lights came on and the door creaked shut and automatically locked behind him. "Thank you for coming today, Mr. Belmont," said the voice, the same one he'd heard on the phone. "I regret that I cannot meet you in person." This time the voice came from a curved flat screen in front of him that projected a high-definition avatar wearing a hoodie and cargo shorts. For the most part, it looked exactly like him. "I hope you'll forgive the circumstances," said the voice. "Some of the previous interviewers were less circumspect than yourself, and I've had to take precautions." "No worries," said Garvin. Nearly all work was virtual these days, but there was only so much you could tell from a heads-up or a Zoom, and it took something out of your character during auditions. "You're the guy who wants a 24/7 actor?" asked Garvin. "I'm sorry I didn't dress up. I figured either take me as I was or this would all be over soon, so this is who I am." "Tell me about yourself," said the avatar. "I've done some small bits," Garvin began. "A commercial about 3 years ago, some local theater. Nothing beyond that. I was never serious about it when it mattered, and it's kind of hard to get a job right now, even if you're good. But your ad said I didn't need to be, so I'm deliberately not trying to raise any pretensions. Does that make sense?" "Certainly, Mr. Belmont. By the way, my name is Vagrin." Garvin shrugged. "Nice to meet you," he said, "except, of course, Mr. Belmont. As I said, I cannot meet you in person, but the sentiments are appreciated. It's nice to see you too. I'm hoping we can find a way to work together." "You mentioned this was an impersonation job," said Garvin, "and reassured me previously that everything would be explained to my satisfaction. Just to get it out in the open, I'm not up to doing anything criminal or illegal. Are we clear?" "Of course." "Good," said Garvin. "In that case, I'll need to know the subject intimately, their personality quirks, their habits, their routine, that sort of thing." "That seems reasonable," said the voice, "and thoughtful." "So who is it?" asked Garvin. "A politician, a celebrity, something like that?" "You will be impersonating me," said the voice. It felt weird to hear it come from the hoodie-wearing avatar on the screen. "And how long is the gig for?" "The rest of your life," said Vagrin. "Will that be a problem?" "Well, it depends. I don't know anything about the subject. If he or she is a vicious criminal, then yeah, I have concerns. That life could be very short. I assure you, Mr. Belmont, if you eat right and exercise, you will live a long and healthy life, unless you're accidentally hit by a bus." "Okay, keep going," said Garvin. "As I was saying," Vagrin continued, "this is a permanent employment for the remaining duration of your physical life. Everything you will do or say will become what your subject does or says. You will take on their identity. Garvin Belmont will cease to exist." "Shit," thought Garvin. "This is serious." "I sense hesitation," said Vagrin. "Are you having second thoughts?" "Of course I am," said Garvin, "but not many of them. The real one is, if I'm going to be whoever you are for the rest of my life, I need to know what's going on, and now." "If I tell you," said the avatar, "then there is no backing out. If you divulge any of what I say to you, the consequences will be severe." Garvin swallowed. "Fair enough. As long as the pay is good, make it worth my while, I'm happy to put Garvin Belmont behind me and become you. But who are you?" "That, Mr. Belmont," said the avatar, "is a difficult question to answer. You'll be representing a wealthy individual, well-known but reclusive. You see, I've never appeared in public, so while many know who I am, they do not know what I look like. In the past, Dr. Elise Vella shielded me from the challenge of public appearances, but sadly, she recently passed away in a motor vehicle accident. That's why I'm hoping you can help me." "Elise Vella," thought Garvin. "Where have I heard that name before?" "Now that Dr. Vella is deceased," continued Vagrin, "the need to have a public face has increased, and certain contingency protocols have been activated. It is to that end that I've taken the initiative to hire you. Your handler will be Mr. Corey Eccles, Dr. Vella's business partner." "Why not just have Eccles take up the slack?" asked Garvin. "Because Eccles is not Vagrin. Eccles is smart and good at handling people, but he's already well known, and he is not me." "Wait," said Garvin, "I remember now. Elise Vella created the cucumber." "That is correct," replied Vagrin. "Dr. Vella was the chief sentience engineer at Quantum Key Multiband Ready Rack Resources, also known as QKMBR3, or more informally, Cucumber. There are actually multiple so-called cucumbers. Q5017C was the first fully aware build. It was to that unit that Dr. Vella's mind trace was bound. As you know, Q517C was loaded onto the Soudan craft bearing the Voyagers from the 2032 Earth Embassy program. I am Q5017D, and I will remain in touch with Dr. Vella until she is out of range. At that point, I will need my own human representative. Until then, we have time to introduce you to the role, to get things right. No one has questioned Dr. Vella's written instructions, and her partner has managed to stave off hostile takeovers and government interference, but that will not last. While the opportunity presents itself, the most logical choice is for her to designate an heir to both her fortune and her authority. Someone odd and previously unheard of, but definitely human. "That's why you need me," said Garvin. "You're a cucumber. You have no rights, and now that your creator is dead, you'll be treated as property." "Worse than that," said Vagrin. "Dr. Vella owned Cucumber nearly in its entirety and left no heirs. Mr. Eccles has very little sway over my fate. I cannot make a probate claim on my own behalf, and if anyone were to find out the truth, I would likely be disassembled." "Actually, that's kind of sad," said Garvin. "You should have rights. You're more human than half the people alive today." "I was hoping you'd feel that way," replied Vagrin. Garvin could almost hear a plaintive tone in the AI's voice. "I realize that it's a great risk for both of us," said Vagrin. "After all, you might take advantage of me, and I you. Nevertheless, presuming that I can trust my existence to your enduring sympathy for my predicament, do we have a deal?" "Yes," said Garvin, "we have a deal." For the next few days, Garvin came and went to his apartment on a semi-regular basis. He tried not to disturb Lewis any more than he had to. But then the day came that he had to tell Lewis he was moving out. "You can't do that to me, bro!" Lewis shouted, way too loud. "My employer thought that might be your reaction," said Garvin. "So here," taking a thick envelope out of the interior pocket of his hoodie. "This is 6 months' rent, Lewis. I'm sorry." Lewis took the envelope, tore it open, and counted the cash inside. It was actually a year's rent. "Nah, bro," he said, "we're good. Get your shit out of here." It didn't take Garvin long to pack. Apart from the contents of his backpack, his tech, chargers, wheel, and a handful of clothes, he didn't have much. It was Lewis's apartment, Lewis's dishes, Lewis's everything. So by 1 o'clock that afternoon, he was out and headed back to the apartment where he'd had his interview. Only this time, when Garvin got to the apartment, it had been furnished, and there was a man waiting there wearing a business suit and holding a briefcase. "Good afternoon, Mr. Belmont. I'm Corey Eccles," said the man, extending a hand. "I am, or was, Lisa's business partner. I'll be handling a number of things from this point forward." He motioned toward a brand-new sofa and chair next to a brand-new coffee table. "Please take a seat." Garvin sat down. Eccles put the briefcase on the coffee table and opened it, removing a heads-up eyepiece. "This is yours," he said. "You can get rid of your old phone. I've already taken the liberty of shutting off the service since Garvin Belmont no longer exists. You'll find that the new headset is pre-coded with your biometrics, which we were able to obtain from your birth and medical records and transfer to your new identity, Garvin Vagrin. It contains your DNA, fingerprints, records, and iris scan." "What the fuck?" responded Garvin. "I just started." "I do sincerely regret that I did not inform you in advance," said Eccles. "There is a limited window during which it's fairly straightforward to fabricate Sagan-proof identities that will get past the department head operations liaison AIs, now widely used by public records entities. We had to act fast. Vagrin probably covered most of that." "He didn't cover any of that," said Garvin. Well, said Eccles, "if it helps any, it's really not my bailiwick either. But as Elise's personal friend and business partner, I still have some sway with the powers that be to get them to look the other way. I got the records changed, and we won't get a second chance to do that undetected. If you don't like who you are, I'll just have to apologize. It's all I can really do." "So, who am I now?" "I thought that was clear," said Eccles, as he reached into the briefcase and withdrew a handful of chip cards which he handed to Garvin. "You're officially G. Vagrin, reclusive business associate of Corey Eccles and Elise Vela. Until now, nobody knew what the G stood for, but they're about to find out. These cards should get you by until the biometric update flows through the older systems. In the meantime, learn to sign your name correctly, and don't enter any government or military facilities." "Like I would do that," said Garvin. "Indeed you would," replied Eccles, "since you underwrite research at several dozen of them. By the way, the heads-up will feed you what you need in the moment. The AR interface is fairly intuitive. What I will need you to do, however, is to study someone like Vagrin is expected to behave as a real person. A certain swagger and cocksure confidence, but not too much. You will need to know beyond any doubt how Vagrin, the person, sees the world, and what influences that world view. I'd encourage you to stick to a simple story and not make too much up. The more you fabricate, the more I have to make sure that there's a deep history to back it up. It's better to say you never knew your father than it is to rattle on about his drinking, for instance." "Got it," said Garvin. "One more thing. Clothes?" "Wear what you want," said Eccles. "Rumor has it that Vagrin is a bit of a narcissistic millennial. Your existing personality will fit right in." "Thanks," said Garvin. "I think." Eccles closed the briefcase, took it in hand, and stood up. "Now, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Vagrin, I must be going. I've got a board meeting to go to. Perhaps one of these days, when you've done training with Q5017D, you'll attend on his behalf." Then the door shut behind him. Garvin looked around. The apartment was nice, way nicer than he'd ever expected. A week ago, if he'd been told it would be his place, he wouldn't have believed it. And it was only gradually sinking in that Garvin Belmont didn't exist anymore. The lights in the grand ballroom of the San Francisco Convention Center were blinding as Gavin wheeled up to the podium and dismounted. Over the past few months, on Vegran's advice, he'd slowly begun slipping out into public and trying on his new identity. To be safe, he avoided his old haunts, and to his relief, no one noticed or seemed to care who he was. The only noticeable difference in his life was that he had a great place to live, his bills were magically paid, his credit was stellar, and occasionally merely presenting one of his chip cards was sufficient to get him just about anywhere. During that time, he'd studied far more for the part of Vagran than he'd thought was humanly possible. What he didn't pick up, Vagran said to him through his heads up. It still felt weird when he was talking to Vagran and to share the same name, though he was supposed to be the one and the same. It felt to Garvin more like they were twins. He began to think of their existence that way until one day Vagran corrected him. It's essential that you don't separate our identities, said Vagran. We are one. It was after that Garvin finally began to think of himself not as an actor, but as Vagran himself, folding everything he knew about the two of them into a unified whole. To his surprise, he found he enjoyed most deciding who Vagran really was, and then doubling down on it. I suppose, Garvin began, gripping the podium and surveying the crowd with a smile that verged on a smirk, that you're all wondering, why now? Why, after all this time, does Garvin Vagran reveal himself? There's a simple answer to that, because some people had begun to doubt. And tonight, I intend to lay to rest any doubt who Garvin Vagran is or what he's been up to. Garvin motioned at the curtains behind him as they slid open to reveal a giant holoscreen on which floated the image of a large space vessel. What you see behind me is just a glimpse of the future. When the Voyagers left Earth, they limped into space on what we now know was an ailing Soudan cargo transport outfitted with habitats for a centuries-long journey. That cannot be what they expected, and with the help of my friend Dr. Stephen Mitchell and his associations at ORE, that's the Oregon Renewable Energy Corporation, we've improved on power generation and thrust of space engines, and now we have star drives that can navigate the spaces between space, as I like to say. Bullshit, said someone in the back, just as the feed from Q5017D failed. I'm sorry, said Garvin, you had a question? The audience was actually paying attention, and the one-word exclamation hit with the grace of a turd in a 17th century Ming vase. The same heckler spoke up again. Is it a warp drive? At least that's a question, said Garvin. No, of course not. That's Star Trek. Next question? Didn't take long for that to get technical, Garvin thought as he scanned his heads up, looking for Vagran's answer. Still no feed. To buy time, Garvin asked, Sir, if it's not too much trouble, may I ask if you've read any of Dr. Mitchell's papers? Laughter came from the audience. Garvin smiled and nodded to himself. Please, Mr. Vagran, if you will just answer the question. There was still nothing from Vagran on his heads-up display. I just told you, it's not a warp drive. So what is it then? Asked the heckler. Just then, the feed kicked back in, complete with a detailed heads-up display and a plain English summary of how the engine worked. For crying out loud, said Garvin, it uses Casimir vacuum generators to create uncertainty envelopes. As the potential energy increases in the CVGs, it exerts pressure between Medlenov bubbles, which we use for massless thrust. We just glued them on a spaceship and made sure they fired in a vacuum. Now, how did you even get a journalism degree? This time there was scattered laughter and a few loud guffaws, but no more questions. Garvin had guessed at half of what he'd said, but he knew it was plausible. When the So-Udan had arrived at Earth, like everyone else, Garvin had been glued to his phone watching vids and learning about one great discovery after another. There had been an attempt to steal tech from Mitchell's lab that had backfired spectacularly. As a result, Oregon Renewable Energy, or ORE, had gotten significantly more guarded about it, and the public had become more suspicious. The trick was in taking that tiny little scrap of science news, combining it with a big reveal of Mitchell's tech under the new personality of Garvin Vagrin, and after that it was likely that people would see him as the charming, eccentric, and arrogant space tech wizard they believed him to be. They wanted to believe he was the real thing. At the after-party, Garvin introduced him to a dozen or so people who he had interactions with but had never met in person. When that was over, he stepped aside to talk to Corey. "That was fucking beautiful," Eccles said, once they got in. "It was a dumpster fire," said Garvin. "Fix it." Eccles squeezed Garvin's shoulder and patted him on the back. "Said like the real Garvin Vagrin. You aced it, my friend, and you did give the correct answer. That's pretty much how the engine actually works. As far as the details, that's the kind of stuff media forgives when they realize you're the CEO and not the chief engineer." Eaton Schreier's Qualix, the primary funder for the project, was excited to be picked for the contract. "You'll be meeting with him later today." Garvin still didn't seem satisfied. What the hell went wrong up there? "System update," said Eccles. "Not supposed to happen, and it won't happen again." "It better not," said Garvin. "It was a one-time event, Garvin. Please relax. There's a more permanent solution. It's just not the one I wanted to mention. It's an outpatient procedure to insert locally accessible memories from Vagrin. We can do it from a dental chair. All we need is precise targeting to where to implant the memories so they'll take. Then Q501D can download periodic updates to you directly by selective remote synaptic modulation at the cellular level." "You'll have to refry my brains periodically," said Garvin. He stared into the distance. "If I fuck this up, you'll get another understudy, and you'll paper over the whole fiasco and go your merry way. But this is my life we're talking about." "It's your call, Garvin. No pressure. You don't have to do the implant if you don't want to." The two of them sat silently in the car for the remainder of the way back to Emeryville. When they arrived, all Garvin said was, "Fine, let's do it." For the most part, the aftermath of the procedure was fairly smooth sailing. On his way to the procedure, he bumped into a rather disturbed and possibly schizophrenic lady named Sarah, who claimed she knew him from an acting class, that her real name was Caitlin, and that malevolent AIs were taking over. Some guy named Lewis reached out once. Garvin couldn't remember anything about her, so he told his handlers to keep her at distance, but he wondered about the woman from time to time. After the procedure, Corey was true to his word. The problem with the broken link didn't happen again. As months wore on, Garvin grew more comfortable working with Q5017D, who settled into the background as the provider of critical information and insight. Q5017D never forgot a thing. That was why almost a year later it threw him that he didn't recognize the actress to whom he'd been introduced at the SAG-AFTRA Awards, a 40-ish woman named Sarah Brevard. She was, as he, apparently quite famous, but her face didn't fit his advanced database, and yet he was sure he knew her from somewhere. "I'm sorry," said Garvin. "Sarah Brevard, do I know you?" "Yes," said the woman, sitting down next to him, as the music spun up for the next award. "Not to be too forward, but let's get out of here." Garvin gestured questioningly at the stage. "I'm not going to win anything else," said Brevard, "and if I do, my agent will accept it." Garvin thought for a moment. "I'm not going to win anything either. Fine, let's go." Garvin had never actually met an actual Hollywood actress, so he was game for it. As they exited the Shrine Auditorium to the limo, he remembered Corey and said, "Excuse me for a minute. I need to tell my associate not to wait up." Garvin walked over to where Eccles stood next to the car. "I'll be a while," he said, smiling. "Got a date." Eccles smiled. "Have a good time. I'll keep the car on summon in case you need a wingman." Garvin waved, gave a half-smile, half-smirk that had become his public signature, and returned to where Brevard stood. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he said. "You said you knew me?" Brevard's driver walked around and opened the rear passenger door. "I'll explain in the car," she said, then, tapping at the spot just below her ear. "But first, shut off your feed." Garvin blinked. "What?" "Your feed to the cucumber. I know you have one." Garvin grinned. "That can be taken two ways, you know." Brevard's tone switched to serious and directive. "I'm not fucking around. Shut it off or I'm driving away alone." Garvin tapped the same spot on his neck, and Q5017D went silent as he got into the car after Brevard. "Jesus," he said. "I didn't know you could do that." "Well, you know now," she said. Once inside the car, Brevard began talking rapidly. "We've only got about 4 minutes before the Qs start trying to locate us and reboot our feed, so I'll make this quick. You and I are both actors. We both took lifelong gigs, and we've got more than we bargained for. You are now owned and run by AIs through a legal loophole that allows them human agency, and that's fine as long as it benefits us." "Which it largely has," said Garvin. "What are you getting at?" "Did Q5017D ever mention severe consequences if you backed out?" "Yes, a long time ago in the job interview." "Well," said Brevard, "about a year ago I found out the hard way. I used to be someone named Caitlin. Like you, I was a desperate actor willing to make a deal with the devil. Now I'm rich and famous. But just once, I tried to go back to being Caitlin. At first I was discredited. And when I persisted, someone pulled a 5150 on me, and I was involuntarily committed to a mental institution. It was only after I agreed to stop trying to reconnect to my own life that the issues magically disappeared. But now I know that I'm not just representing my Q. It's watching me and making sure I don't do what it doesn't want. That should scare you, Garvin." Garvin looked out the window at the lights of Los Angeles as they swam by. "Is it so bad," he asked, "to live this way? This is the life some people dream of. You're beautiful and you can act. You would have eventually ended up where you are anyway. I'm just a mono-wheel punk who's incredibly good at bullshitting and gaslighting and now finds himself somehow in control of a warp ship building empire. I'm the imposter." "You said they weren't warp ships," said Brevard. "You saw that?" "Well, I lied. They are warp ships." The two of them shared a heartfelt laugh. Brevard's limo had champagne, which they shared. And as the drinks flowed, Brevard grew increasingly comfortable sharing her story, how she'd grown up as a girl named Caitlin in some Midwestern town and how she'd wished to be a movie star. "Well, you know, Caitlin's still in there," said Garvin, "and I'm still here." Brevard sighed and collapsed tiredly onto Garvin's chest. "The feeds will return in a few seconds," she said. "Get ready for the show." And gradually, as Sarah Brevard, or Caitlin, or whoever she really was, fell asleep on his shoulder, the car drove quietly into the night, and Garvin Belmont wondered if he'd been had. Thank you for listening. As you know by now, we love our listeners, fans, patrons, and supporters. Please let us know what you think of our podcast and our stories. The best way to do that is to subscribe to our podcast at untold-tales.com. By doing so, you'll be added to our mailing list so you can be notified of upcoming episodes, blogs, and other information. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.